Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Trump has announced a pullout of U.S. forces from Syria after what he called the defeat of ISIS. Hours later, and after much condemnation of his Syria decision, came the resignation of Jim Mattis and talk of a U.S. drawdown in Afghanistan. Can the U.S. just walk away from countries it has intervened in? To discuss this and a lot further, we're joined now by Dr. Tariq Sherkawi, who is the manager of TRT's World Research Center, and he's joining us live now via Skype. Tariq, thanks for joining us. We're also joined here in the studios by Omer Jamal, who is a security analyst and is also a lecturer at FCC. Omer, thanks for coming into our studios to join us here today. Tariq, I'll start with you. What did you make of Trump's announcement, regarding Syria and the fallout?
Well, I think this is a very interesting development. We are witnessing, again, yet another wave of disengagement from the United States of the region. I believe this was already started by Obama, during the 2000s. However, I think that we should also be very cautious when we analyze these things. I don't think we have to take these developments at face value. We have many units of analysis here. Of course, the withdrawal is not like in itself a problem, because the United States was acting merely as a spoiler in Syria. They didn't have enough capacity to prevent whether the regime campaigns against the opposition, or to prevent even Iran from acting in the region. It has, of course, there are definitely losers in this matter. It appears that the Kurdish forces are the biggest loser in these operations. Yeah. But we have also to remain cautious. I think there is a very high level of unpredictability that Trump is bringing. We remember that in 2016, he was complaining that the foreign policy of the United States was too predictable. So he's adding now this level of unpredictability in order to impose some high stakes to the different players. In my opinion, I think there are different people, different forces in the region that should be really concerned by this disengagement, because it might mean wider schemes, wider designs. Right. I would single out Iran first, but also Turkey.
Okay, so Omer, what do you make of that? Do you think that the likes of Iran and possibly even Russia, many people talking about that online in reaction to this decision, that Russia wins in this case? What do you make of that?
I mean, first to talk about what Trump thinks of the whole situation. So I would agree with the other colleague said. I mean, this is more about what Trump thinks, and this is not about what the U.S. policy has been. So, I mean, Trump's worldview is that he believes that we are putting in money which is going to waste. He believes that over, sort of forces are fighting other people's wars, and he does not want U.S. sons and daughters to die, in wars which are for Trump. Does not have any rationale. But on the other hand, his aides, his people in Pentagon, people in Defense Department, they have been advising against what Trump just did. But I mean, then it comes down to is what he thinks and what he believes in. And if you just follow his Twitter timeline, it's all clear what he believes in, and it's hardly. I mean, the resignation of his defense secretary is actually a reflection of the confusion which is going on in DC. I mean, in terms of what Russia thinks and in terms of what Iran thinks of this, I think they are the clear winners. And even there was a statement yesterday by Putin that if US has decided to withdraw its forces from Syria, so he's sort of said this is a good decision. So in a way, I mean, for Trump, he stands to gain domestically. I mean, whether you like it or not, his political base in the US, they are going to like the decision, because that's what he is trying to focus on. And he does not care about what is happening in terms of foreign policy. And we have seen in what he has done in Afghanistan, and the reports have already come out that the decision was made together that to withdraw forces from Afghanistan as well and to withdraw forces from Syria. So when you mix up the Middle East and the Afghanistan, you don't see a sort of, a dedicated thought process which is going into the decision making. You only see someone just woke up and decided to withdraw forces. So I think it's going to cost US a lot in terms of their strategic sort of presence in the region, and it's going to further sort of alienate their alliance with the West and other countries which have been in alliance with the US.
Let me pick up on a point you just made there, Omer, and put that to Tariq. Tariq, on the argument that Trump makes that the United States, obviously, as we well know, has spent trillions of dollars in these years on these many interventions in this region. On that argument in and of itself, as well as the loss of lives of U.S. soldiers and U.S. forces, he has a point there, doesn't he? That walking away from these wars would be a good thing in that sense.
Well, I beg to differ, in some sense, because I think when you look at who Trump right now trusts the most is Bolton. And Bolton was the architect of the war in Iraq in 2003. He's known to be very aligned with the neocons. He's a warmonger. He promotes wars in the Middle East constantly. So I don't think that this withdrawal is strategic. I think it's tactical. That's where I differ with most analysts on this subject. I think that, yes, the numbers in Syria were not high enough to sustain any kind of strategic operations in the region. However, the withdrawal would also pave the way for more conflicts and provoke definitely more tension. So let's just assume for a minute that Iran is going to fill the vacuum that is left by the United States. This will provoke Israel and provoke even the Russians, because the Iranians would have more clout and more say on the affairs of the region. So we are not witnessing the end of escalation and the end of conflict. We are probably witnessing the start of a new episode, and I think this is what is created by this withdrawal.
Okay, so then in a sense then, Omer, the feeling I'm getting is that this, both of you agree, is an irresponsible move, because at the end of the day, it's a situation which the U.S. already created by intervening in these countries, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, one can argue that I mean, people are actually calling it a foolish move and it's an irresponsible decision. But I think I would agree with the other colleague that it's in a sense, it's a technical decision, but it's going to be contested. Even his statement, I mean, the withdrawal will happen in a phase, but we may see another decision coming out of the White House, which may actually pose a different situation. I think as we talk, people are trying to make sure that what Trump said actually is not happening on the ground, because if that happens, then you have a vacuum which is not going to be filled by what U.S. interests are. It's going to be filled by what the U.S. interests are not, and that is where Iran stands, and that is where Russia stands. And they stand to gain, in terms of what they want in Syria. They stand to gain in terms of what they have been wanting in Iraq and the larger Middle Eastern picture. So I think, from here where we are, which is the statement of withdrawing of troops, and to where actually this happens, I think this is sort of a timeline which is going to be very important. I think we may see more surprises there.
Okay, so and Tariq, we obviously know that the Russians are happy about this, and I know we've alluded to this already, but Putin made that statement vis-a-vis Syria, and then obviously when it comes to Afghanistan as well, Donald Trump had made it obvious, of course, that as Canada as well, that he had wanted to walk away from all of these American interventions abroad, as he would call them. Do you think that there has been Russian pressure really on this U.S. president to walk away from these wars? Because that's been spoken about a lot right now, especially domestically within the United States. Was this Putin pressuring Trump, and did he succeed in that regard, do you think?
Well, it's very difficult to speculate, but on the face of it, definitely I would say that the Russians are one of the main winners of this current situation. A withdrawal from Syria would theoretically at least pave the way for the Assad regime, which is supported by Russia, to regain these territories. So on the face of it, yes, Russia is one of the main winners and the clear winners in this operation. Similarly, in Afghanistan, I think the Russians were preparing the grounds for a peace process. They were more like in talks with the Taliban and others in order to, instill the kind of necessary instruments and environment to nurture peace in the region. The United States recently started again against their policy to discuss with the Taliban, and I'm sure that the Taliban had like some high threshold to go into these talks, and one of them was the partial withdrawal of American troops, at least. So we have seen that happening so fast, at least in a declaration and announcement format. The devil will be in the details. We'll see more as the situation unfolds. But what I can say, and I agree with your statement, on the face value, on the face of it, the Russians are the winners. Whether they drove this situation directly or whether Trump, because he wants to play this unpredictability game, let us not forget that in terms of foreign policy, he is using what we call the theory of Nixon. The theory of Nixon was the madman theory. So he's playing this madman that he's so unpredictable,
right,
and therefore he's too dangerous to be taken lightly. So he wants his adversaries to be more afraid of him and thereby obeying basically what he wants to do. But in this case, there are other players, and these players are also playing very well the game. The Russians are ones.
Omer, let me go to you. When we're talking right now about this, specifically talking about Afghanistan, we know the Taliban want the U.S. out. That's been their condition from day one, really, for any peace in that country. Do you think that this is possibly a tactic on the part of Trump to try to appease the Taliban in some way?
Well, I would like to address this question in two ways. I mean, you know, the understanding in the U.S. has been for some time that it's the situation of stalemate. So on the one hand, you have you know, U.S. forces which have been in Afghanistan for 2 decades, and now, I mean, in 2018, recently a study came out, and which actually the figures quoted were that more than 40% of the territory of Afghan territory is being controlled by the Taliban, and rest is being contested, and you don't see much of the government outside Kabul. And in this situation, you have a president who actually does not want to do anything with foreign policy. And so from day one, and even during the election campaign, his sort of position was that I want to bring back troops from Afghanistan. And he has actually, I mean, for good or for bad, he has actually, you know, sort of worked on that. What his advisors have been saying, that is one thing, but what Trump has insisted is that I want the troops to come back from Afghanistan. And we have seen a lot of negotiations being, you know, have been taking place, and you see the role of Pakistan as well. We have seen a lot of pressure coming on Pakistan to sort of facilitate what US wants in Afghanistan. And recently, a few days ago, there were talks in UAE, and Pakistan was part of those talks. And we don't actually know what was discussed in that room. But what has happened during the last 24 hours is that Trump has also said that we are withdrawing almost half of what the troops number are in Afghanistan. And whether this was discussed, whether this was agreed in that room, we don't know that yet. But whatever the situation is, it appears that Trump is impatient. He actually wants to you know, withdraw the troops. And for the Taliban, this is their condition number one, that this is what they have been saying for the last 10, 15 years. And if this was agreed, we'll see some sort of, you know, quid pro quo from the Taliban side as well. And if that happens, this may set up, you know, sort of a background for what the talks are going to be.
Right. All right, let me try to go to Brigadier Shaukat again. Brigadier Shaukat, if you can hear me, I wanted to ask, what do you make of the situation vis-a-vis withdrawing from Syria as well as drawing down in Afghanistan? Is this a move, as I'd put to my other guests, that to appease the Taliban?
If they try to appease the Taliban, is long overdue, because this is both Syria and Afghanistan are failures of the U.S. In Syria, the U.S. is siding with the IS, which is Syrians. They're allied with them, and to be alongside, fighting alongside them is something which is very funny, very odd. On the one hand, they're cursing these guys, and on the other, they're fighting alongside them. Here in Afghanistan, this should have happened a hell of a long time back.
Okay, let's just go for a very short break, gentlemen. We're going to continue, of course, talking about this entire issue as we've described, and of course, talk about the other related issues that come up as well. Stay with us for that. Thank you very much for staying with us, viewers, as we continue to discuss these U.S. withdrawals from Syria and Afghanistan, and of course, all the implications of that, such as, of course, Jim Mattis resigning. We're still joined by Omer Jamal, who is here with us in our studios in Lahore, and we're also still with Tariq Sherkawi, who is the manager of TRT's World Research Center. Tariq, I wanted to bring you in and hone in on that point that the Brigadier had made just before he left, before that break, about the fact that the U.S. really is the one that has created this entire mess, A, and B, should have really walked away a lot earlier. Do you think, Tariq, that this region and the countries of this region can handle whatever the U.S. leaves behind themselves if they're able to come together and unite, be it for Syria, be it for Afghanistan, or otherwise?
I think you're right on both points. The first, of course, the United States since 2001 has embarked on a variety of conflicts and wars. These wars were very ill-defined. They had no real strategy except some holistic and very shallow kind of objectives. And when they come to Afghanistan, for example, okay, they dislodged the Taliban from Kabul, but this is a country which is very, very hard to handle. The Taliban has used the classic guerrilla warfare tactics, and they traded basically space for time. And we see that these tactics now are working, and they have basically torn the U.S. Forces down. And now the U.S. wants a way out because there is absolutely no way to defeat the Taliban. What they did now is to change their objectives from wanting to defeat the Taliban to just prevent the Taliban from winning, which is a different ballgame altogether. And we are seeing now more talks. So definitely on point one, the United States, since 2001, since the so-called war on terror, was just embarking in very random wars without any real stakes there, except wars itself. On the second point, yes, I think the possibilities are there to handle the chaos left by the United States. We've seen yesterday in Istanbul, actually, or in Ankara, we saw the meeting between Russia, Turkey, and Iran. So this means that there is already some discussions on how to handle the situation in Syria. I suppose in Afghanistan, this could be the same. Pakistan is a major player. I think the Russians also want to wrap up the situation. So, I mean, all the conditions are there to handle the road to peace, unless the United States again acts as a spoiler.
Okay, I'm being told that Brigadier Shaukat is back with us, in fact, on a better line. So let me try to go to him once again. Brigadier Shaukat, I wonder what you would make of Pakistan's point of view on the United States drawing down its forces in Afghanistan. Is that, do you think, would that be seen as a positive thing in this country?
This is long overdue. I thought that this is something that should happen quite some time back. It's very difficult for an army like the U.S., supposedly touted as the mightiest force in the world today, to admit that a ragtag force like the Taliban could have defeated them. But that is the case. And it was time that they left. If they don't want to admit defeat, well, that's okay. That's fine. They've done that before. And if that's the case, then let them find some excuse and get out at the earliest possible. The KGB, I think it was, used to say that out of chaos comes order.
Right.
That if they leave here, the sooner they leave, the sooner chaos begins and the sooner order will return. But there's one point in this that I think most people keep missing. A few months ago, there was a meeting of foreign intelligence chiefs in Islamabad, hosted by the ISI, the intelligence head of Russia, Iran, and China. They met here in Islamabad, and they talked about Afghanistan. This was supposed to be a secret meeting, but it was announced later, and very interestingly, it was announced by the Russians.
Right.
Not by the hosts, Islamabad, they didn't announce them. Not by the Chinese, who must have been prominent players. Russia is enjoying the support of China now for strategic support for quite some time. So we know that if Russia speaks, it is what is okay to China as well. So, but it didn't come from China. The Russians announced.
Right.
And there's a method to this madness, you see. If if there is a secret meeting which is announced, there is some purpose to the announcement. And I think the announcement is actually to let it be known that Afghanistan is a matter of prime interest for countries. And if the U.S. is going to continue making a mess of it, these 4 countries will help sort that mess out.
Very well. Let me put those points in. We're joined by another guest who's joining us to have a conversation. We're joined now by Mr. Bob Ayers, who is an international security analyst, and he's joining us live now from the UK. Bob, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. What do you make, Bob, of the announcements of the withdrawal from Syria of U.S. forces, as well as the drawdown in Afghanistan, and Jim Mattis's resignation as well, as an implication of that decision? Is this a good thing for the United States?
Absolutely not. Let's look at the forced withdrawal first, and then we'll address Mattis's resignation later. The forced withdrawal has both tactical and strategic implications. The tactical implications are that with the U.S. leaving the field in Syria, it leaves the field open for an expansion of Russian influence in the area, which was one of the reasons the U.S. was there in the first place, to counterbalance the Russian influence. It also leaves the Kurds horribly exposed. For years, the Turks have been trying to wipe out the Kurds, and they have not yet been successful in doing that. The Kurds allied themselves with U.S. forces in Syria, and so they had U.S. protection while they were fighting ISIS. With the U.S. leaving, the Kurdish overhead protection provided by the United States is gone. Now, those are tactical implications of the U.S. withdrawal. There are strategic implications as well, and those are the most important. What the unilateral announcement of withdrawal has done is it's told all American allies that you can't trust the United States. You can't work with the United States as a trusted partner because they will make unilateral decisions. There will be no consultation. They will leave you exposed. They will leave you hanging. And this is not the way to negotiate international agreements and international relations in an interconnected community. General Mattis' resignation, very clear. He thought that this was a stupid decision. He has been unable to influence the president to change his mind, and Mattis took the honorable thing and resigned his post. Now, there'll be some spin on trying to spin it, but basically Mattis is saying, I can't tolerate this anymore. It's gone beyond my comfort level, beyond my threshold for pain. I quit.
All right, so let me put some of those points. Omer, one point that Bob there made is that of the U.S. and its relationship with its own allies. You know, Donald Trump has declared that ISIS has been defeated.
Yeah.
France, Germany, the UK disagree. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's very clear what everyone else thinks and what Trump thinks. So Trump just plainly says that, ISIS is defeated in Syria and that was my mission. And the mission is complete, and we are going home. And while we see, the allies of the U.S., which are also in Syria, and because of the U.S. engagement, I don't think they were even consulted before Trump actually announced this or made this decision. So, I mean, we already know that France is staying, even after what Trump says, and we already know that some other countries from Europe, they're staying in Syria. But I mean, Jim Mattis' resignation is actually what the U.S.'s policy is. So actually, people who have worked in these regions and who understand the strategic nature of international relations and how alliances take place and how once you are somewhere in a war zone or in a conflict zone, you just not quit in an hour and go back. Such decisions, they take years and decades to take some sort of form, so everyone is sort of angry or disappointed or alienated. You can give it any form, but as far as the European allies are concerned, I think they are disappointed, but they are disappointed in a way that they do not have a way to actually sort of influence US policy. And someone who could have been influenced was Jim Mattis or some other people, and they are all resigning. So you have Trump at the top, who actually does not listen or hear anyone. So it's actually, you know, it's all gone down the rails.
Right. Okay, so Tariq, I'm wondering what you make, Tariq, of this announcement that A, that ISIS has been defeated on the part of Trump, and B, what do you make of the question of the Kurds? Because I would imagine, Tariq, that especially between the meeting between the Iranian and Turkish leadership, that question of the Kurds must have also come up, wouldn't it have?
I think that for point one, ISIS has been effectively depleted. I mean, it didn't disappear completely, but they don't have any real control over any sort of mass territories. So they have been depleted. There is no fighting force capable of doing what ISIS was doing about 3 years ago or 4 years ago. So on that point, there is some merit to Trump's declaration, but it doesn't mean that the whole strategy is correct. I totally agree with the point of Bob that this now puts the United States in a very bad light, because no one would trust the words of the United States. Yeah. The Kurdish forces, the PYD, which is basically an arm of the terrorist organization PKK, have been foolish to think that the United States will be there for them on the long run. They commonly do this mistake from Iraq to Syria to other places, so they will face the consequences. I think from the second point, yes, definitely the Turkish leadership and government are liaising with other governments, especially Iran. I think the Kurdish territories or authority over certain territories will be definitely a point on these talks. I think Turkey is not very comfortable on seeing like very armed, heavily armed militias that are connected with the terrorist organization on its borders. Yeah. So its national security is definitely at stake, and there is no way they will accept that.
Bob, I'll come back to you then. And the question then now remains, Bob, is that who will fill in the gap once the United States walks away from Syria, A, and B, even drawing down in Afghanistan? Will this essentially just be like handing the country over to the likes of ISIS and Taliban, respectively?
Well, let's take them in reverse order. In Afghanistan, pulling U.S. forces out will indeed be handing the country back to the Taliban. And once that is done, they will grow in strength and grow in strength and grow in strength until they become a politically viable entity once again. In Syria, the question of who will fill the gap if the U.S. leaves, I don't think is the right question. Okay. The right question is there anyone who will fill the gap? And the answer to that is no. The United Kingdom military forces are not adequate to replace the U.S. contribution, nor other European forces like the French and the Germans. And once the U.S. leaves, the only reason the French, the Germans, and the Brits were there in the first place is because they were in an alliance with the United States. And if their alliance partner goes home, they have no reason for staying. Now, we have two things that we have to consider. The first thing is I've heard several of the other guests talk about General Mattis trying to influence the U.S. foreign policy. Mm-hmm. Well, I would be a little cautious in saying that the U.S. has a foreign policy these days. The U.S. foreign policy seems to be to do whatever you need to do within the next 24, 48, 72-hour period to get press coverage or to get votes. There is no concerted, planned, coherent, predictable foreign policy in the United States today.
Bob, if I could push you, I apologize for interrupting, but on that one point, wouldn't Trump argue that, listen, on this point, actually, I've been consistent from day one. I've wanted to pull out of Syria and Afghanistan, and we can go back to 2011 and tweets that Trump put up then saying, why are we in Afghanistan still? Why are we losing all these lives and this money? He's actually been consistent on these points, hasn't he?
Well, there's a big difference between what a candidate for office says and what an incumbent in the office says. Now, even if his announced intent was to withdraw from Syria, and he carried that announced intent with him into the White House, the way you execute that is through coordination with your allies, coordination with your military leadership, coordination with the legislative branch, and then effecting that withdrawal in an orderly, planned, controlled, least damaging manner. A foreign policy isn't what the president declares via tweet that morning, and his own government doesn't know what the policy is until they read his tweet. That's not a foreign policy. That's not a fulfillment of a campaign promise. That is irresponsible behavior. Now, the only real concern that I have is whether or not America's allies are able to differentiate between the Trump administration and the United States. Because the United States, I think, will return to sanity once this administration leaves office, and the old United States of the old ally, the old internationalist country will begin to appear again. But right now, I wouldn't trust the United States on a bet.
Very well. Let me add another voice to this conversation. We're joined by Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh, who is a former ambassador to the U.S., joining us from Karachi. Mr. Sheikh, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. So, Ambassador Sheikh, I'm wondering what you make of these U.S. decisions at this time. Is this just chaos, or is this Trump just following through with his promises? How does this look to you?
No, it isn't. It isn't Trump following through on his promises. And certainly I'm not sure as to whether we should regard all this as having happened. I read the accounts that have appeared so far with regard to Trump having decided to withdraw half the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. And what I concluded was that this is not a decision that has been made yet. That the National Security Advisor is apparently opposing it, and no announcement has been made. The announcement with regard to Syria has been made, and this has not yet been made. So I think that there may be some room for change in this regard. Now, what happens if it, in fact, this is something that is followed by the sort of withdrawal that is being reported? I think it'd be a rather nasty reversal of what the administration has chosen to do so far. By taking this particular step with regard to Afghanistan, President Trump is ignoring what his special envoy for Afghanistan, Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, has done so far, and what he needs to do to move forward. It is also against everything that the military personnel that he's assigned to Afghanistan have recommended or are the goal that they are trying to pursue. So I think perhaps there will be a little, the best way to describe it is that there would be a chaotic situation. After all, in Afghanistan, he has, they say 14,000, I think it's 8,000 U.S. troops there.
Yes.
There are about 8,000 NATO troops there. And there are about 35, some people say, but my own estimate is 50,000 contractors who are working for the American forces in Afghanistan. So it's going to be a matter of moving not 7,000 troops, but also discomforting a much larger number. So,
Ambassador Sheikh, if I may come in, because I wanted to ask you and push you on that point. You're saying that this would create a chaotic situation, but I imagine others may argue that, listen, if the U.S. created this mess to begin with, how can it be trusted really to be able to solve this mess that it has, created with its own hands by intervening in this country? What do you make of that argument?
No, the argument is sound, because the number of mistakes, no matter what that 9/11 was affected from Afghanistan, by Osama bin Laden. That much is true. But beyond that, when you look at the number of opportunities that the Americans had to try and resolve this, and perhaps even ask the question as to why Osama bin Laden was allowed to go to Afghanistan at all. He was in the Sudan. He could have been kept in the Sudan under careful watch because the Sudanese were at that time very anxious to curry favor with Washington, and they would not have allowed him to behave in a manner that was contrary to American requirements, and yet they sent him to the one country where he was regarded as a hero. Mm-hmm. So if you want to talk about American blunders, that's part one. Part two is that they had many occasions on which the Taliban had asked for an amnesty and said that we would allow us to return to Afghanistan as private citizens, and these were turned down. So the number of mistakes, if you wish to count, are very many. But the point is that right now, particularly we in Pakistan, have to contend with the fact that the situation has arisen, and we would like it to be settled in a manner that towards which Mr. Khalilzad was beginning to move. A peaceful settlement, peaceful reconciliation, and I think the prospects for that were good. And I think that perhaps if given an opportunity, his military commanders will still try to urge him not to press this, and if they do, then they're going to press for the fact that, all right, we'll withdraw our military advisors, but we'll maintain the counter-terrorism force that you have there, and maintain our air operations in full support of the Afghans. The Afghans, unfortunately, have suffered about 28, according to President Ashraf Ghani, have suffered more than 28,000 dead soldiers killed since they took over in 2014, and they cannot sustain this sort of these sort of losses.
Indeed. Okay, Ambassador Sheikh, I do apologize for coming in, but we're going to announce a very short break, and we'll go into a break, and of course appreciate the insight that you provided, as well as the insight that Tariq provided as well. I'll ask the other guests to stay with us for the moment. We'll continue discussing all these related topics to these announcements by the Trump administration, of course, as well as Jim Mattis's resignation and what all of this means. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Thank you very much for staying with us, viewers, as we continue to discuss this decision by President Trump to withdraw from Syria and draw down troops in Afghanistan, as well as Jim Mattis's resignation. Omer, you've been listening very patiently to what all of our guests have been saying so far. I wonder what you make of their observations so far, specifically, of course, in the context of possible chaos that will be left behind versus whether this region can handle its own affairs. Do you think there's an argument to be made for the U.S. to walk away at this time, and for this region's countries, such as one of our other guests mentioned, the Iranians, the Turks, the Russians, the Chinese may possibly be able to work out a peaceful resolution to both Syria and Afghanistan? Well,
I think if we talk about Afghanistan, so I want to make a distinction. So we don't have the situation of 90s now. During the 90s, we had Soviet Union falling on its own, and you did not have the China and its influence with what you have today. So, I mean, we don't know it publicly, but I would be surprised if there are not no sort of discussions or negotiations taking place among China, Pakistan, Russia, and other concerned states, which are preparing for the post-U.S. withdrawal order in Afghanistan. One can argue that, I mean, with the U.S. withdrawal, we can discuss where U.S. stands and what are the losses and gains for the U.S. But in terms of the region and what happens after U.S. withdraws, I think we are going to see sort of a sustained effort on the part of regional states, a more sort of united effort and organized effort to bring back, a sort of stable Afghanistan, because all regional states, including Pakistan, China, Russia, they stand to gain, within Afghanistan, which is actually stable and politically more, functioning on its own. And with all states having more sort of focus on economic, what the opportunities are coming up and what is going to happen in next maybe 1 decade, and what the China's plans are for the region and the broader world. I think the post-US withdrawal is not going to be sort of, if someone argues that it's going to be just a another implosion in Afghanistan. I mean, the Afghan Taliban, one can argue that, they may not like the US in Afghanistan, but they're not irrational actors they have a clear sort of vision for what they want, and whether the US has been able to influence what they want is something else. But I think they are, and they're, Afghan Taliban, they are an actor which you can, sit with and discuss what you want and what they want. And we have seen a lot of meetings taking place in China, in Russia, even in Pakistan and UAE. So they come, they sit with you, they discuss, but where they do not, agree with you, they let you know. And they see US as a direct enemy, and that's their position has been very clear that we want US out. And, on your other sort of question regarding Syria, I think Syria is going to be more difficult. I mean, with Afghanistan, we have a solution, maybe, but in Syria, I think it's going to be a vacuum which I don't see anyone filling in very easily, even with the US withdrawal, if it takes place. We know that Iran is going to, make an effort to sort of fill in, and Russia is going to make an effort. But it's a region which is, filled with a lot of actors, and you have a lot of sub-state actors and the state level actors which are trying to make space for themselves. So with the US withdrawal and with the lot of confusion with the Western side stands on the issue of Middle East and Iraq and Syria, we'll see a lot of sort of maybe falling out with what happens in Syria as a country, and we may see the resurgence of ISIS as well, because it's one thing to say that the ISIS is simply defeated, but the ISIS hasn't come out of where they are the people who actually have fought wars for the last 20-30 years in Iraq and in Syria, and they're not going anywhere. So if you don't have a consistent effort, trying to make sure that the ISIS does not resurge or come up again, you will see some sort of action happening.
Okay, so Bob, I wonder what you make of that, because I know you mentioned as well this issue of the vacuum that may arise, specifically when it comes to Syria. I imagine the Syrians, though, and I'm talking specifically about the Assad government, Bob, would argue that, listen, why would there be a vacuum when it's our country, and we would fill that vacuum, we would take, quote unquote, our sovereignty back. What do you make of that, Bob?
Well, I think that's probably their strategic objective, to take their sovereignty back. Unfortunately, they don't have the military capability to do that without external support, ergo the Russian involvement. What I think we're going to see happening in Syria is several very interesting things. The first thing that's going to happen, I believe, is the Kurds are going to be targeted by ISIS. They're going to be targeted by the Assad regime. They're going to be targeted by the Russians in support of Assad, and they're going to be targeted by the Turks. So early on, the Kurds are going to be in a position of having no friends and surrounded by enemies. Once the Kurdish problem is resolved to some degree, I think what you'll see is Turkey's involvement becoming less, Russia's involvement becoming more, as they focus more and more attention on stabilizing the Assad regime. And to do that, they have to wipe out ISIS. China may or may not have an economic role to play, but there will be no military role to play. And I think we'll see the European powers pulling out.
And so, Bob, let me ask you this then. Is it a bad thing for Russia to come in and work on defeating ISIS?
Is it a bad thing? It depends, I guess. The question is whether or not you can point to any historical point in which Russian or Soviet involvement external to their borders was a positive thing for the local environment, for the hemispherical environment, or the world environment at large. You have to question what would be the objectives of the Russians aligning themselves closely with Syria. It gives them access to warm water ports. It gives them more influence in the region. It gives them a military base that puts them closer and closer and closer to the oil fields in the Mideast. It gives them a strategic advantage in the area. And all of those positives that accrue to Russia are at the decrement of other regional powers.
Omer, I'll give you the final word. What do you make of that? Because any above players obviously have their own interests when it comes to Syria or Afghanistan. So would it be a bad thing, though, for Russia, for example, to be involved versus the United States? As in, you know, the replacement of one or the other major superpower, does it really make that much of a difference, in your opinion?
Well, I would agree with you, but I mean, then you have to sort of discuss, you know, you have two big major players in Middle East, and in terms of where the conflict is in Syria. You have United States and its allies on one side, and then you have Russia and its allies on the other side. And then you have a country where you have, you know, different smaller, you know, militant groups and other sectarian sort of groups and ideological fighting for one power or the other power. And then if you go down, you have a population which has suffered for a long time. I mean, we can argue, I mean, if I talk about the US, we can discuss, I mean, with the withdrawal, what US stands to lose and what Russia stands to gain in terms of where the Russian interests are. But I mean, in the end of the day, it's the Syrian sort of population and the Syrian country, which is, you know, is not at the right place, and it's not where it should be. So we have seen like millions of people, you know, just leaving the country because of what has happened over the last 5-6 years. I mean, with any situation with Russia and with the US and how they have tried to play their sort of presence and their political objectives, the Syrian country is just, you know, is the victim of the entire situation.
Okay. I'm just going to actually try to play a clip of Donald Trump and the announcement that he had made regarding Syria. Let's see if we can play that clip right now, and we'll be right back.
We've been fighting for a long time in Syria. I've been president for almost 2 years, and we've really stepped it up. And we have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly. We've taken back the land, and now it's time for our troops to come back home. I get very saddened when I have to write letters or call parents or wives or husbands of soldiers who have been killed fighting for our country. It's a great honor. We cherish them, but it's heartbreaking. There's no question about it. It's heartbreaking. Now we've won. It's time to come back. They're getting ready. You're going to see them soon. These are great American heroes. These are great heroes of the world because they fought for us. But they've killed ISIS, who hurts the world. And we're proud to have done it. And I'll tell you, they're up there looking down on us. And there is nobody happier or more proud of their families to put them in a position where they've done such good for so many people. So our boys, our young women, our men, they're all coming back. And they're coming back now. We won. And that's the way we want it. And that's the way they want it.
All right, that was Donald Trump and the announcement that he had made vis-a-vis Syria specifically. Let's bring in another voice to this conversation just before we conclude our show today. We're joined now by Mr. Mark Sloboda, who is joining us live now from Moscow, and he is an international affairs and security analyst. Mark, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. Mark, I wonder if you can just contextualize this announcement of Syria's withdrawal as well as the drawdown in Afghanistan from the Russian point of view. We did have President Putin supportive of the American decision to leave Syria and seemingly for the drawdown in Afghanistan as well. What more can you tell us about the Russian point of view here?
Yeah, thanks for having me on The Scope. An honor and a pleasure. This is obviously President Trump's version of George W. Bush's mission accomplished moment. If this is what the U.S. president needs to tell his people about the U.S. role and position in Syria in order to end their illegal military invasion and occupation and get out of the country, fine. I mean, that's if that's what he needs to tell them. As long as they're leaving, that's fine. But we should have no illusions about what the U.S. has been doing there. They illegally invaded the country. They have no authorization under international law. They do not have the permission of the UN-recognized government of Syria, which has asked them multiple times to leave. Their role there has been mixed, to say the least. the first 2 years of the conflicts, the proxy war that was started with the U.S. illegally arming and training Islamists and sectarian militants that were allied with al-Qaeda, and for the first 2 years of the conflict were actually allied with ISIS.
So Mark, Mark, what do you make though, Mark, of the argument where, you know, in a situation, a political situation within the United States where we have what's called Russiagate or the Russia collusion case, on Donald Trump's head as a rain cloud that follows him wherever he goes, and then, you know, we have President Putin coming out strongly, essentially supporting Trump walking away from Syria. That does, and I'm sure you've seen it on social media, it's played out in a sense where it's saying, hey, Putin is the one pulling the strings, and Trump just says, yes, yes, sir. What do you make of that, Mark?
Well, certainly this is the American domestic context, and, you know, I think Russians understand that half of their country has basically denied agency to the other half that disagreed with them and won the election. When the Russian president voices a note that finally a political settlement is possible if the U.S. pulls out, he's not catering to the U.S. domestic audience. Right, he's not couching his words, worried about whether Donald Trump will be viewed by this resistance hysteria, this neo-McCarthyite witch hunt. When he says this, he's simply glad that it's happening, and the American audience isn't the only one in the world that needs to hear that.
All right, I'm being told that we have run out of time, so we'll leave that as our final word. But of course, we appreciate all of the guests that have joined us for this show. Right now, we were speaking to Mark Sloboda, who is speaking to us live from Moscow. We also had Omir Jamal, who is very patiently joining us for the entire segment here in the studios in Lahore, and he's a security analyst. We also earlier had Dr. Tariq Sherkawi, who is manager of TRT World Research Center, Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh, former ambassador to the U.S., who is speaking to us live from Karachi. We had Bob Ayers as well, international security analyst from the U.K. And we also then had Brigadier Shaukat Khader, who is joining us live from Islamabad, and he is also a security analyst. Now, viewers, as our guests throughout have spoken about, there are concerns, of course, about what happens when the United States walks away from Syria and draws down in Afghanistan. Who fills the vacuum? What does this mean for U.S. allies who disagree with Donald Trump? Is it a good thing that Jim Mattis resigned, that he clearly said in his resignation letter that it would be more appropriate for a Secretary of Defense who agrees with Donald Trump's point of view? Is that a good thing for the U.S. to only have people in power who all agree with each other on every single policy? What does all of this mean? We'll discuss all of this, of course, further and keep a very close eye on all those developments in later episodes here on Scope. But thanks for watching. I've been Waqar Rizvi.